LRBT2, flaw number 13. So we have a columnist making an argument here. Oh boy, we love our columnists. So we're going to try to figure out what exactly is flawed. So we have to remember this is going to be something that happens in the argument and that actually hurts the overall point of the argument. So our columnist is saying that, countries debating legislation. That's a fact. And they're saying the implication of this legislation is that it would force manufacturers to increase the number of paid vacation days for employees, to pay higher overtime wages, and to pay all daycare expenses for children of each employee. So basically, it's going to force us to take better care of kids and help our employees that are parents do this. Interesting. This legislation is being supported by members of groups that have resorted to violent tactics in the past. Okay, so we got, let's see, countries debating legislation. Legislation has impact for vacation days, families, higher overtime wages. So basically all the good living things. People who have been violent before are currently supporting it. There's also people supporting it who are facing indictment on tax evasion charges. Okay. Conclusion, we must defeat this legislation and what it stands for. So let's just kind of think about this. So I don't know about you, but if I'm thinking about what this legislation stands for, I'm like, okay, so it stands for general human well-being. So defeating this legislation, we know that there's a couple of negative things in here. Our columnist has brought up people who've used violent tactics, people who are facing indictment on tax evasion. So there's an assumption here that this legislation stands for what these people have done in the past or something along those lines. There's a necessary assumption here. And we'll get to the point where with necessary assumptions, you'll realize if you negate it, it wrecks the argument because it's, like it's a flawed argument. It needs this assumption to hold it together. That's what the columnist is. They're taking it for granted. They are putting it in here. They're also just bringing up some negative things and saying, oh, we must defeat this legislation. They're hoping that you get distracted by all the negative things that are happening and that you don't realize that, like, it's okay. Just because these people did it in the past does not guarantee that they're going to do this now. It doesn't say anything about what this legislation is about because this legislation is actually about positive things going on here, right? So we're going to look for something that, happens in the stimulus and hurts our argument. It's flawed because it attacks legislation. It does by calling into question the integrity of the originators of the legislation. So this is, I don't know if it's integrity necessarily. We could just be saying that these are terrible people. This is actually a little too specific and it's causing us to take a jump and saying, oh, well, we are attacking the people, but are we attacking their integrity specifically? We'll hold on to this answer choice. B, assails legislation, so attacks, on the basis of the questionable character of supporters of the legislation. This is a little less of a jump because, okay, all we know is that these people have been violent in the past. They're facing indictment on tax evasion. Those are negative things, negative character traits or character blemishes. I don't know. But we know that that's questionable. We're not labeling it as like, bad integrity. We're just saying this is questionable. And it's using these things to attack the legislation. This is both a more general and a more specific argument than A. More general in that, it's talking about questionable character rather than integrity. But it's also more specific because we are talking about it's regarding the supporters and talking about the legislation. Whereas in A, now when I think about it, originators of the legislation, we don't know if these people supporting it were the originators. So I'm going to renege and say based off of that, A is not going to be our answer. Originators is going to be that key word. It assumes, to pick A, assumes that the originators are the people that are supporting it. B will kind of leave. I'm liking B. C, attempts to discredit legislation by appealing to a public sentiment for those who would be adversely affected. We don't talk about those who would be adversely affected here. D, presupposes that legislation is bad legislation whenever it has only a small number of supporters outside the country's national legislative body. What in the world? We don't know if this is a national legislation. We know the country's debating legislation, but hey, what if it's on the state level and the country is like just involved because every single state is debating this, and so like that's one. National legislative body, I think, is just too vague. That's kind of like nitpicky stuff. But ultimately, what makes D wrong is we don't know if there's only a small number of supporters outside the body. And we're not saying that it's bad legislation. They're just saying we need to defeat the legislation what it stands for. They could say it's good legislation, but it stands for bad things. We don't know what makes legislation good or bad. So D is not going to be the correct answer here. E, rejects legislation on the grounds that its supporters act inconsistently in seeking to place burdens on manufacturers upon whose business success the supporters depend. So the fact that they mention manufacturers in that second line, intriguing, but we're not really talking about manufacturers at all. And there's multiple other reasons why this legislation is trying to be passed. So we want to keep that in mind. B is going to be the most plausible answer here because we are attacking legislation. There's questionable character involved, and that's pretty much why the columnist wants to defeat the legislation. No other really solid reasoning there. It says just enough to get the job done. So B is the best answer for this question.